I never told my son-in-law I was a 4-star general. Then his father slid an envelope across the table. The envelope was cream-colored, the expensive kind with a linen texture, and Walter Combs slid it across the dinner table like he was placing a bet he already knew he'd won. "Just something for you and Mia to think about," he said, not looking at me. He was looking at his son. I didn't touch it. I set my fork down instead, and I noticed my daughter's hand freeze halfway to her wine glass. "What is it, Dad?" David asked, though something in his voice told me he already suspected. "Open it," Walter said. "It's not a trick. It's an opportunity." David opened it. I watched his face while he read, because that's a habit you never lose. 26 years of reading rooms, reading men, reading the half-second before someone decides to lie to you or tell you the truth. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the bottom of the page and stopped there, like he'd hit something solid. "It's a check," he said quietly, "for $400,000. Mia set her glass down so hard the wine jumped over the rim. "For what?" "For a fresh start," Walter said, spreading his hands like he was offering a gift instead of an insult. "A house in a better part of town. Somewhere with better schools once you two get around to that. Somewhere a little more suited to David's future." "Suited to David's future," I repeated. It was the first thing I'd said all dinner, and Walter finally looked at me, the way you'd glance at a piece of furniture that had unexpectedly spoken. "No offense, Eleanor," he said, in the tone men like him use right before they intend plenty of it. "But we both know this neighborhood, this house, this situation isn't exactly where I pictured my son ending up. I built something. I want him building something too. Not coasting." I could have told him then. I could have set my napkin down, folded my hands, and said the 6 words that would have changed the temperature of that room by 40 degrees. "For decades, Walter. For stars." But I didn't, because if there's one thing 3 tours and 2 Pentagon postings teach you, it's that the moment you reach for your rank to win an argument at a dinner table is the moment you've already lost something more important than the argument. So instead I said, "That's a generous offer. What's the condition?" Because there's always a condition. Men like Walter Combs don't hand out $400,000 out of tenderness for their daughter-in-law. Walter smiled, and for just a moment I saw exactly what kind of man he really was. "No conditions," he said. "Just think about the kind of environment you want to raise children in when the time comes. Think about who your friends are, who your neighbors are, who's around the table at Thanksgiving. David's got a future in my company. A real one. But he needs a wife who understands what that future requires." "And I don't," Mia said. "It wasn't a question. I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." David hadn't said a word in almost a full minute, which was somehow louder than anything anyone else could have said. I watched him look at the check, then at his father, then at my daughter, and in that look I saw 28 years of a boy trying to be good enough for a man who measured goodness in square footage. "I think," David finally said, sliding the envelope back across the table, "we're going to stay right where we are." Walter's jaw did something small and controlled, the kind of movement men practice in mirrors before boardroom meetings. "That's your choice," he said. "But choices have consequences, son. I hope you remember that." He left 40 minutes later, kissing Mia's cheek like nothing had happened, shaking David's hand like he was closing a deal instead of ending a dinner, and telling me it had been lovely as always, Eleanor, with the specific flatness of a man who'd never once wondered what I actually did with my days. After the door closed, Mia sat back down across from me, and for a while neither of us said anything. "He's never going to stop," she finally said. "Is he?" "No," I said. "Probably not. What are we supposed to do?" I thought about that question longer than she probably expected me to. I'd spent 31 years learning that the loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous one, and the most dangerous one is rarely in a hurry. Walter Combs wasn't going to change his mind about my daughter or my family because we asked him to, or because David stood up to him at one dinner. Men like that don't get talked out of their contempt. They get shown, eventually and unmistakably, exactly how wrong they were. And if I'd learned one other thing in all those years in rooms full of men who underestimated me, it was this: you don't win that kind of fight by raising your voice. You win it by being patient enough to let the truth do the work for you. "Nothing yet," I told her. "We wait. We watch. And when the time is right, we'll know exactly what to do." She didn't understand what I meant. I didn't explain it to her either, not that night. But I'd already started thinking, in the quiet, careful way I used to think about troop movements and supply lines and things that needed to look inevitable by the time anyone else noticed them happening. To understand why an envelope full of money made my hands go cold with something other than anger, you have to understand who I actually was, underneath the woman Walter Combs saw across his dinner table. For 31 years I served. I enlisted at 19 out of a small town in Ohio where the biggest ambition most girls had was marrying well and staying close to home, and I built a career one impossible year at a time: logistics, then intelligence, then command, then rooms where I was the only woman and often the only person who'd actually walked the ground we were arguing about on a map. By the time I retired, I'd commanded more soldiers than Walter Combs had ever employed, overseen operations that moved billions of dollars in equipment and personnel across 3 continents, and sat across tables from men far more powerful and far more dangerous than a real estate developer with a chip on his shoulder about his son's choice of wife. I made 4-star general 11 years before I retired. There are fewer women who've worn that rank than you could fill a small classroom with. And when I came home, I made a choice that most people who knew me during those years would have found strange. I didn't correct people who assumed I'd worked in logistics, or some kind of government consulting. I didn't bring it up at parent-teacher conferences or neighborhood barbecues. When Mia met David and their relationship got serious, I never once mentioned it to the Combs family, and I told my daughter, gently but firmly, that I'd prefer she didn't either. It wasn't shame. God knows it wasn't shame. It was something closer to protection for her and honestly for me too. I had spent 3 decades being defined by rank, by the stars on my shoulder, by what I represented instead of who I was. I did not want my daughter's marriage, her home, her Thanksgiving table, to become one more room where people looked at me and saw an institution instead of a mother. I wanted for the first time in a long time to just be Eleanor. Somebody's mom. Somebody's neighbor. Somebody who baked slightly overdone banana bread and forgot people's birthdays sometimes, and didn't have 4 stars anywhere near her kitchen table. Mia understood, mostly. She'd grown up watching me leave for deployments and come home changed a little more each time, watching the toll all that responsibility took even as she never fully knew the size of it. She respected the boundary I'd drawn, even when, especially when, it meant swallowing hard every time Walter Combs looked at our family like we were something he'd stepped in. What none of us accounted for was how far a man's contempt could travel once it decided it wasn't going to be corrected. The first sign that Walter's envelope wasn't a one-time overstep came about 3 weeks later, when David came home from a Sunday visit to his parents' house looking like someone had let the air out of him. "Everything okay?" Mia asked. "My dad wants me to take over the Western developments," David said, setting his keys down harder than necessary. "The multifamily stuff out past the interstate. That's good, isn't it? That's what you've wanted. It's in Denver." The silence that followed told me everything about how deliberate that offer was. David had a good job in the city, close to home, close to his mother-in-law, close to the life he and Mia had spent 3 years building. Denver was 14 hours away by car. It wasn't a promotion. It was a relocation dressed up as one, and everyone at that table understood it for exactly what it was. "He said it's a 2-year assignment minimum," David went on. "Maybe longer if it goes well. Bigger title. Bigger money. And if you say no?" David didn't answer that, which was its own answer. I sat with my tea getting cold and thought about the particular species of man Walter Combs belonged to, the kind who never raises his voice, never says an unkind word directly, and simply rearranges the furniture of your life until you find yourself somewhere you never agreed to be. I dealt with versions of that man in briefing rooms and procurement offices for 3 decades. Politicians who just wanted to understand the budget better, right before quietly defunding a program they didn't like. Contractors who just had some concerns right before slow-walking equipment shipments to soldiers who needed them. The tactics were always some version of patient, deniable pressure, applied until the target simply gave up and did what you wanted. I recognized it instantly because I'd spent a career learning to counter it. "David," I said, "can I ask you something? What does your father's company actually build? Out past the interstate." "Affordable multifamily housing mostly," he said. "There's a veterans housing initiative he's been really vocal about publicly. Got some good press for it last year." Something in the back of my mind, the part that had spent 31 years learning to distrust convenient timing, quietly filed that detail away. Vocal how? Ribbon cutting stuff. Local news. He gave an interview about honoring the sacrifices of veterans, giving back to the community that raised him. David gave a short, humorless laugh. It's good PR. Landed him a state commendation, I think. I didn't say anything else about it that night. But I made a note the way I used to make notes before I understood exactly what I was looking at. A small, precise itch at the back of my mind that told me something about that story didn't sit right. I want to be honest about something. I did not go looking for a way to destroy Walter Combs. That was never the plan, and if it had been, I don't think I could have lived with the woman I'd have had to become to do it. What I did was something closer to what I'd done for 31 years whenever something felt wrong and nobody else seemed positioned to notice it. I asked questions. Quietly. Patiently. To the right people. I still had contacts, of course. You don't spend 3 decades in that world and simply lose every number in your phone the day you retire. I called an old colleague, a woman named Ruth Alvarez who'd spent her post-military career in the Inspector General's office before moving into state-level housing oversight, the kind of unglamorous work that keeps contractors honest on federally subsidized projects. Eleanor Hargrove, she said when she picked up, like she was tasting the name after a long time away from it. General. It's been years. Just Eleanor these days, I said. I need a favor, and I need you to tell me honestly if it's inappropriate to ask. I told her about David's father, about the Veterans Housing Project, about the ribbon cuttings and the commendation, and I asked her carefully because I still believed in doing this the right way, whether Combs' development had ever come up in any compliance reviews. There was a pause on the line that told me more than words would have. I can't share an active file with you, Ruth said. But I can tell you that name isn't unfamiliar to us. And I can tell you that if you're asking because it's personal, you should be very careful, because personal and professional don't mix well in this kind of work. Understood, I said. Can you at least tell me if there's a formal complaint on record? Something I could look into through public channels, without you having to break any rules. Ruth was quiet again. Then, there's a whistleblower complaint filed 8 months ago. It's public record if you know where to file the request. I'd start with the State Housing Authority's Compliance Division. Ask for anything related to occupancy safety inspections on the Meridian Ridge project. That was all she gave me, and it was more than enough. It took me 11 weeks to build the full picture, and I did it the way I'd built every difficult case in my career, patiently, methodically, through public records requests. A retired structural engineer I'd served with named Frank Delgado, who owed me a favor from a very different kind of emergency 20 years earlier, and 2 conversations with residents of Meridian Ridge, who were more than willing to talk once they understood I wasn't a journalist looking for a quote, but someone who genuinely wanted to help. What I found wasn't complicated. It rarely is with men like Walter Combs. Complicated crimes get noticed. Simple ones survive because nobody looks closely enough. Combs Development had won the Meridian Ridge Veterans Housing contract 2 years earlier with a bid that promised reinforced fire suppression systems, updated electrical infrastructure appropriate for the number of units, and accessibility modifications required under the terms of the federal housing grant that partially funded the project. The final construction, according to Frank's review of publicly available permit filings and inspection reports, had cut corners on nearly all 3. Fire suppression systems installed in roughly 60% of the units instead of the contracted 100. Electrical work that had passed a first inspection but showed signs, in later maintenance requests filed by residents, of undersized wiring straining under modern appliance loads. Accessibility ramps installed in common areas, but missing from nearly a third of the individual units that had specifically been designated and funded for wheelchair-accessible occupancy. The whistleblower complaint, filed by a former site supervisor named Danny Ruiz who'd been let go from the project 6 months before completion, alleged that Walter Combs had personally signed off on substituting cheaper materials after the contract was finalized, pocketing the difference in a company account structured to make it look like ordinary cost overrun management. Ruiz had been quietly fighting for 8 months to get anyone in the state compliance office to take the complaint seriously, and in that time Combs Development had used the Meridian Ridge project, the very same one built with those shortcuts, as the centerpiece of Walter's public image as a community-minded developer who honored veterans. I sat with that information for a long time before I decided what to do with it. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I did not want to hurt David. I did not want to hurt Mia or put my grandchildren, whenever they came along, in the position of watching their grandfather face public disgrace. I thought more than once about simply handing everything I'd found to the state compliance office and stepping back, letting the system run its course without my name attached to it at all. But there was a problem with that plan, and it was the veterans living in those units, men and women who'd served, who'd been promised safe housing as part of a program built specifically to honor that service, who were instead living with fire risks and electrical hazards in inaccessible units because a man who'd never served a day in his life had decided their safety was a line item he could shave for profit. I had spent 31 years being responsible for people's safety. I did not know how to look at that information and simply let it sit in a folder, while Walter Combs cut ribbons and collected commendations. So I called Ruth back. I want to help Danny Ruiz's complaint move forward, I told her. Not quietly. Not buried. I want it looked at properly, and I want to understand what my role can legitimately be in making that happen. Your role, Ruth said carefully, can be exactly what it should have been from the beginning. A retired officer with relevant oversight experience, offering a formal statement of support for an existing whistleblower complaint, and requesting an expedited safety review given the population involved. Nothing more, nothing less. You don't need to invent anything, Eleanor. The evidence does the work. You just need to make sure it's not sitting in a drawer. That was, in the end, exactly what I did. The compliance review took another 5 weeks, during which I said nothing to David, nothing to Mia, and nothing to Walter Combs, who continued in that time to make small, deniable moves toward pushing his son to Denver. He brought it up again at a birthday dinner for Mia. He mentioned it to David's mother, who mentioned it, gently and with visible discomfort, to Mia at a Sunday lunch, in the transparent hope that pressure applied sideways might work where pressure applied directly hadn't. I watched my daughter grow more tired and my son-in-law grow more quietly torn, caught between the father who'd raised him and the wife he loved, and more than once I wanted to simply tell them both what I knew and let the truth do its work early. But I had learned, a long time ago, that revealing information before it's fully verified and properly positioned doesn't produce justice. Produces chaos, and men like Walter Combs are very good at surviving chaos. What they aren't good at surviving is documentation delivered publicly, at a moment when they have no room left to spin it. The moment came on a Saturday morning in October at the second annual Meridian Ridge Veterans Appreciation Ceremony, an event Walter Combs had organized himself in front of local news cameras, a state senator, and roughly 40 residents of the complex he built, to celebrate the one-year anniversary of a housing initiative he described, in his opening remarks that morning, as proof that this community takes care of the people who protected it. I was there. I hadn't told anyone I was coming, including Ruth, who I'd asked simply to make sure the state compliance director attended given the public interest in the event. Mia and David were there too, invited as family, sitting 3 rows back from the small stage where Walter stood in a gray suit, smiling for a photograph beside a plaque with his own name on it. I want to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment. I didn't. I felt the way I used to feel before a difficult briefing, steady, focused, and a little sad about what the truth was about to cost people who hadn't done anything wrong except trust the wrong man. The compliance director, a woman named Patricia Kemdram, stepped up to the podium after Walter's remarks, ostensibly to deliver a routine acknowledgement of the state's partnership on the project. Instead, she thanked the residents for their patience during what she called an active safety compliance review of this property, prompted by a whistleblower complaint and further supported by an independent request for expedited review. She stated, plainly and without embellishment, that preliminary findings had identified fire suppression and electrical deficiencies in a significant number of units, and that the department would be conducting mandatory safety upgrades at the developer's expense, effective immediately. I watched Walter's face while she spoke. I'd spent 31 years learning to read the exact moment a man realizes the ground beneath him has already shifted, and I saw it happen to him in real time, the practiced smile locking into place a half-second too long, the eyes searching the crowd for someone to blame, finding nothing. David turned to me. I don't know what he saw in my face in that moment, but something made him ask very quietly, "Did you know about this?" I helped make sure it got looked at properly, I said. That's all. How? I could have told him the truth right there, in the noise of that crowd, with cameras still rolling and his father's career visibly cracking 20 feet away. But some conversations deserve better timing than a public reckoning, and this was one of them. "I'll tell you everything tonight," I said. "I promise." We sat in my kitchen that evening, the three of us, long after the news vans had left Meridian Ridge and Walter Combs had stopped answering his phone. "I need to tell you something about myself," I began, "that I should have told you a long time ago." I told David the truth, plainly and without embellishment, the same way Patricia Kemderim had delivered hers that morning. 31 years of service. 4 stars. Command experience that had, among many other things, taught me how to recognize the particular shape of a cover-up long before most people notice anything's wrong. I told him why I'd kept it from his family, not out of shame but out of a wish to be, for once, simply somebody's mother instead of an institution people performed politeness toward. I told him about the envelope, about Denver, about the 11 weeks I'd spent quietly gathering what eventually became the backbone of a state safety review that likely saved lives in that complex before something far worse happened in one of those units with faulty wiring. David didn't say anything for a long time. "You could have told me," he finally said. "Any of it. All of it." "I could have," I agreed. "But I wasn't protecting a secret, David. I was protecting a version of a life I wanted for your wife and someday for your children. A life where their grandmother is just their grandmother, not a rank. And I wasn't going to use that rank to win an argument at a dinner table over an envelope. I was only ever going to use it, or whatever's left of it, to make sure people who deserved safety actually got it." "He's my father," David said quietly, and there was real grief in it, the kind that doesn't cancel out anger, just sits beside it. "Whatever he did, whatever he's going to face now, he's still my father." "I know," I said. "And I want to be honest with you about something else. I didn't do this to hurt him. I did it because 40 families were living somewhere unsafe while he stood on a stage congratulating himself for it. If there was a way to fix that without it costing him anything, believe me, I'd have taken it. There wasn't." Mia reached across the table and took David's hand, and I watched something pass between them that looked less like a conclusion and more like the beginning of a longer conversation they'd be having for months, maybe years. "What happens to him now?" David asked. "That's not up to me," I said. "It never was. I just made sure someone with the authority to look properly was actually looking. What happens next is between your father, the state, and whatever he decides to do about the people he put at risk." What happened in the months that followed was neither as dramatic as a courtroom drama nor as clean as a Hollywood ending, which is, I found, how most real justice actually looks. Walter Combs was not arrested on television. He was investigated formally by the state, fined substantially for the safety violations, and required to fund the full remediation of every unit at Meridian Ridge at his own expense, a cost that ran into the millions and effectively ended 2 other pending developments he'd been counting on to expand his company. Danny Ruiz, the whistleblower who'd spent 8 months being ignored, received a formal vindication and eventually, a settlement that let him start the small contracting business he'd always wanted to run honestly. The residents of Meridian Ridge got the safe housing they'd been promised in the first place, a year and a half late, but delivered all the same. Walter did not go to prison. The violations in the end were classified as civil rather than criminal, a distinction that frustrated me privately even as I understood, from 31 years of watching systems work imperfectly but not uselessly, that accountability doesn't always look like the ending you'd script yourself. What he lost instead was something he clearly valued even more than money. The image he'd spent years building, the ribbon cuttings and commendations and community-minded developer profile that had let him look down at people he considered beneath him while quietly cutting corners on the very people he claimed to honor. He and David didn't speak for almost 4 months. When they finally did, it wasn't a scene of dramatic forgiveness. It was a long, difficult, unglamorous series of conversations that David has never fully shared with me, and I've never asked him to. What I do know is that David stopped taking calls about Denver entirely, that he stayed in the job and the city and the marriage he'd chosen, and that somewhere in those difficult months, he stopped needing his father's approval quite as badly as he had before. As for Walter and me, we've spoken exactly twice since that morning at Meridian Ridge. The first time he called to ask, with what I think was genuine confusion rather than anger, why I'd never told him who I really was. Would it have mattered? I asked him. He was quiet for a long moment. Probably not, he admitted. I'd have found some other reason not to think much of you. That's on me, not you. It was the closest thing to an honest sentence I'd ever heard him say. The second time at Thanksgiving this year, because families, even complicated ones, find their way back to the same table eventually, he passed me the potatoes without being asked, and called me Eleanor instead of the careful, condescending version of my name he used to use. It wasn't forgiveness exactly on either side, but it was something closer to respect than I'd ever gotten from him before, and I've learned over 31 years in one very long autumn, that sometimes that's the only kind of victory that's actually worth having. Mia asked me recently if I regretted staying quiet about my career for as long as I did. I told her no. I'd give the same answer today. I didn't spend 3 decades in uniform to be defined by it at every dinner table for the rest of my life. But I also didn't spend 3 decades learning to protect people so that I could sit quietly and watch a man endanger 40 veteran families because correcting him might have been uncomfortable. Some battles you fight loudly with everything you've got in the open. And some you fight patiently, quietly, one careful phone call at a time, until the truth is simply too solid for anyone left in the room to argue with. I know which kind I was built for. I always have.